All right, well, we've got a couple of announcements, so we'll go ahead and get started, and I think we'll have a few more people join us before we get down to the fantastic guests that we have for today. Welcome to Crisis Management for COVID-19, Phase 16, actually week 19 we've been doing this. This week we're going to talk about back-to-school issues for employers during COVID-19 and a number of other critical update issues, some legal issues. So we're delighted everybody's joined us. I'm Lyle Hanna with the Hanna Resource Group. We've got some other great guests with us today. Chase, you want to put that next slide up and we'll roll right along here. Of course, Jim Morris will be back. Folks, the guy is so busy, he had to be in court right now. Somebody else on his team got very ill overnight, and so he's going to join us in a few minutes, but keep your fingers crossed, say your prayers, and we look forward to have Jim join us shortly. We also have, though, Brigitte Blom Ramsey, and she's the president and CEO of the Prichard Committee for Academic Excellence. And I'll say a little bit more about her in a minute, but we wanted her to talk about her perspective on getting these schools reopened, and which I think helps all of us reopen. Allison Petrie's back with us, and she's going to be tracking questions, and Autumn Morris is making sure everything runs on time and on target, and Chase is in charge of getting all these people in. We're at 105. So we're making some progress. Let's keep it rolling here. We're going to hit the back to school issues, both from kind of a social perspective with Brigitte, and then Jim's going to do some back to school legal stuff. So let's go ahead and let me just tell you a little bit more about Brigitte, because we're so excited to have her here. She is the executive director of the Prichard Committee for Academic Excellence. She started this about a year ago, and she is so well suited for this. I hope everybody knows how important this organization is, because it's a quasi-public-private organization that helps oversee and really, guide and direct our school systems. They provide a lot of resources to help us have stronger schools. And she has 2 undergraduate degrees in economics and international studies. She's got a master's degree in public policy from the University Martin School. She has done a lot of work in her career on policy research and advocacy, education, poverty, and a variety of other things. She's worked for universities in Ohio and in Kentucky, and she's worked for the Federal Reserve Bank of Cincinnati. I'm sure that was an exciting assignment. She also was the director of public policy for the United Way of Greater Cincinnati. And in that job, I don't know, a lot of people may not know that the Cincinnati United Way has a lot of responsibility in Kentucky. And her job was to coordinate issues related to early childhood education. So she's had a great career, but she's also done a lot of volunteer work. So she's actually spent a decade as an elected member of the Board of Education for the Pendleton County Board of Education. And she was also a governor's appointment to the Kentucky Board of Education for 6 years. So a lot of experience here. Brigitte, we are just delighted you're here. Jump in and tell us what's going on with education and the reopening of our schools and all that stuff.
Great. Thank you so much, Lyle. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone, and exciting to know you're having this conversation every Monday in a time of so much uncertainty when we all need support and conversation. So it's my pleasure to be here with you to talk about schools and how we might think about reopening, not just our K-12 schools, but also our early childhood centers, and thinking through the lens of our colleges and universities and how we get our students back into their post-secondary pathways. So to start, I think we all recognize in our different roles professionally and personally that there is so much uncertainty, and things seem to be changing by the day, changing by the week. Something that was true a month ago, it may no longer be true. In the case of reopening schools, earlier in the summer, the American Academy of Pediatricians said that we should be prioritizing getting our kids back into the school building, back into physical school settings. But a report, research that has come out of South Korea, I believe just in the last week, suggests that school reopenings will indeed trigger outbreaks. And we are seeing outbreaks internationally as schools try to reopen. So I think we're experiencing this uncertainty here in Kentucky. Guidance from the Department of Education was released earlier in the summer, and districts have been using that guidance to decide on their local plans. Many districts across the state are still working on their plans for the fall. Some have pushed back start dates to late August instead of early August, which we've become accustomed to. On July 7th, KDE said 43 school districts had indicated a start date of August 26th. So school districts are trying to give themselves some time. In late June, the Kentucky Department of Education released its Healthy at School guidance, which offers both best practices and requirements for schools to implement. So those include the types of things you all are hearing as businesses. Social distancing, keeping 6 feet apart. Imagine first graders, second graders, third graders, and trying to keep them to 6 feet apart in the school building. So that's the challenge our districts are trying to figure out. If a school is unable to put desks 6 feet apart, students would be able to sit closer together, but masks would be required the entire time. So again, I think if we try to put ourselves in those school classroom settings as a teacher, as school administrators, this is quite a challenge. School districts would have a requirement around things like smaller class sizes, tape in the hallways to keep students further apart. All the things we're seeing in our grocery stores, our home improvement stores, wherever we're frequenting, the same things we're seeing we would want to see in schools. Masks and personal protection equipment. As far as school buses, and I think you have Jim on later who will address some of these specifics from a legal standpoint, but it sounds like the state is allowing buses to be fully loaded as long as the district meets conditions including masks or temperature checks, getting on the bus, or parental assurance that a child does not have a fever over 100.4. But when they get to school, all students will need to have their temperatures checked again. Health screening, all students would have a temperature check when they arrive at school. Coughs or high temperature and other indicators would result in a student being sent home. Additional sanitation and environmental factors, not so different than all of you are experiencing as businesses. And then contact tracing. Local health departments would be working with schools to figure out where a child was sitting on the bus or in the classroom. If a child proves that they have COVID-19, that contact tracing would then be used to see who else had been exposed. But as I mentioned in the intro, guidance is changing kind of from day to day, and there seems to be more concern today than there was even a couple weeks ago, and certainly when the Academy of Pediatrics initially came out with their guidance. Governor Beshear announced 1,000 new cases yesterday. Fayette County, Kentucky's largest district, is planning virtual only classes for at least the first 6 weeks of the school year. Rural districts have been talking about a blended model with parents able to select online or in-person learning for their students. So they're giving parents choice here. And Fayette County is meeting tonight, as I understand it, in an initial meeting, and then we'll be meeting again on Thursday to make a decision about their reopening plans. Again, all with the backdrop of the governor announcing the most one-day cases reported of COVID so far. So lots of moving targets here. Nothing is certain. There's a lot of concern about bringing students back physically as well as not bringing students back physically. So we know parents need to get back to work. Students need to get back into high quality learning settings. We know the challenges if students don't for families. We also recognize that there are significant challenges for student learning if we continue in a remote learning environment only. Chief among those is the fact that broadband access is not universal across the state. And so as we think about the learning of our young children in K-12 settings as well as in post-secondary settings, not all students have access to broadband. Sometimes it's a function of income. Sometimes this is a function of being in a rural area across the state where broadband access is not available or is not secure and reliable. So being able to just deliver education remotely is not our best alternative, but it's clearly an alternative that we're still going to have to figure out how to get used to for students, also for families. I'm fortunate that fortunate as the case may be, that my children are all in their 20s and on their post-secondary path. They will have to figure out online learning in post-secondary. I am not having to figure out how I manage elementary school and middle school children. They're learning at home while I'm also trying to manage a full-time work schedule. But I have employees who are trying to figure that out. And being thoughtful and flexible for them is, I think, a challenge for me as a leader, but also a responsibility for me as a leader to figure out how I can support them to keep their work moving, but also have the time that they need to support their learners at home. It's a challenge for all of us. I think we probably need a statewide support group to figure this out. So Lyle, that's in part what you're doing here, and so appreciate that the support group is coming together. Kind of specific to the kind of, I guess we've talked a little bit about K-12 and post-secondary. Our universities are dealing with the same sort of guidance. And I think we've seen a lot on the news about universities trying to figure out, are they going to go back completely in person, or are they going to go to online only? Students certainly have preferences. My youngest child, who is entering his senior year in college, said to me last spring, as he was experiencing online learning, that if classes continued online in the fall, he thought he'd take a gap year. Well, I'm not sure that's the best idea from a mother's standpoint, but it's important for us to understand that our students are really having challenges in the remote learning environment. And that what we see from high school students right now is a hesitancy to even move into the post-secondary environment. So we've seen lower participation in FAFSA, which is the application for federal aid for post-secondary education. And we're seeing in the state of Kentucky, we've seen, I believe, a 2-year, and this could be a 3-year trend of decreasing college enrollment among our high schoolers. So this is a concern now at this moment in time for families, employers, and school districts. It's also a concern for us at the Prichard Committee as we look a few years out, 5 years out, 10 years out. What will this pandemic have done to our education outcomes in the K-12 space, as well as our post-secondary outcomes? Kentucky is a state that while we've made a great deal of progress in education, and we can say now that our outcomes are in the middle of the nation, this pandemic, if not handled appropriately, could serve to put us behind once again. We're still not at a place where our post-secondary outcomes are at the average in the nation, where we have fewer individuals in the state with baccalaureate degrees and higher than many other states. And so the decline in college going is a real concern as we think about our economy 5 years from now, 10 years from now, if we don't really weather this pandemic well. So lots of concern, but I know everybody's worried about the here and now first and foremost. So with that, I'll turn your attention for a few moments to what we're learning in the early childhood environment. So early childhood is a specialized, I think, concern at the moment because of childcare. It's one thing to have older youngsters at home and to support their learning while their teachers are hosting Zoom classrooms with them and those sorts of things. It's another thing to try and work completely from home or try to get back to work when you have youngsters who are 2, 3, even 4 years old or younger, a newborn, and have really no access to childcare. So we are just now closing a survey that we've sent out to parents to better understand what parents want as they think about trying to get back to work, how they want their children cared for, their very youngest children. And I'll just give you kind of a snapshot of what we're seeing. These results will come out in the next couple weeks and they will be available on our website. We will be using them to help the state and help local communities think through how they provide childcare, how businesses might provide childcare. So almost 30% of parents report struggling to find childcare right now. Of course, if they're being asked to come back to work, childcare has not been fully reopened yet. It's costly for childcare to reopen because of the personal protection measures and the safety measures in childcare centers. So parents are having a hard time, even if they are able to start getting back to work, finding childcare for their children. Half of parents report being moderately to extremely stressed about access to childcare. They're feeling the real pressure, and all of you as HR managers know this. They need to get back to work. They want to get back to work, but they can't do so if they are not confident that their child will be in a safe and protective learning environment. 45% of parents are either unsure or will delay sending children back to some childcare setting because of safety concerns. Of those not sending children back, 15% say they will be more comfortable 3 to 12 months from now, while over 50% remain unsure, even to say where they might be 3 to 12 months from now. The largest concern for parents in sending kids back is health and safety of children and family members. When asked what providers can do to make them feel more safe, the majority of comments related to following proper health and safety guidelines, providing alternative schedules, and reducing the size of classes, all of which cost money. And childcare is already expensive. It's a small business that has a real challenge making that small business model work. 92% of respondents said they support more government support to help providers meet new requirements and guidelines related to the pandemic. So childcare is a specialized, I think, question, but maybe also an area where businesses can really provide some supports that are different than the K-12 and the post-secondary environment. So I think this is an opportunity for us to really come together and think about how do we support employees with young children. And Lyle, I'm going to stop there with that being kind of a high level overview, and I'm happy to respond to any questions.
Boy, that is great. Thank you. That's interesting information. And folks on the call, what we thought was that we have to get our parents comfortable so that, because the kids' parents are our employees. So we've got to figure out what's the combination of activities that need to happen so the parents are comfortable coming back to work, and getting them back into school or daycare. That's a big step in the right direction. So I know we've had some questions come in. Allison, what do you think?
Well, some of the questions have to do with the FMLA leave and the extended FMLA. So I know Jim's going to talk about that. But
I think Jim has joined us, and so he might want to help with that too. So Brigitte, let's kind of work through these together.
So this is about family medical leave. When
yeah, I think and again, if we want Jim to address this, I think it's built into his presentation. But the question was just about extended family medical leave. If there are options between doing in school or online learning, if you're still eligible for that extended FMLA.
Yeah.
And I think
we have quite a bit of that covered, but I'd love to hear her perspective as well.
Well, Jim, thank you. And certainly FMLA is not an area of expertise for me, so I can't respond to that directly. I can just go back to thinking through the lens of being an employer myself. There's an echo, I think, Lyle, is there? Can you hear me? I'll try, okay. It sounds like I'll keep going unless you tell me to stop. Okay.
Yeah, Chase can try to figure it out.
So as I mentioned, I can't respond to the FMLA piece in particular. But I do think it's important that we start thinking about what a new normal will be and what that means for families, for parents who are employees and also have the burden of making sure their students are still learning at home. I certainly have not figured this out with my employees at the Prichard Committee, but thinking with them about how they try to manage, hopefully they're co-parenting at home. But if they're sole parent, how we help them manage that environment, because the learning of their children is critically important and their ability to continue to do their work is so important. We've looked at expanded vacation time. We've looked at reduced hours if folks want to do that sort of thing. We've moved to kind of a project-based approach within our work, which is a luxury that we have, rather than focusing on seat time or that sort of thing.
Okay, so flexibility is going to be really important. You know, one thing that struck me was a lot of the face masks won't fit children. And I don't know if people are going out to try to buy face masks just for their kids, but that could be a challenge. While we're on the call here, I wrote Jim Ford. He's the vice president of the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, and he's been providing PPE to companies all over the state. And he just wrote back and said he doesn't have them, but he can get them fast. And he does a good job of tracking these things down and getting them at reasonable prices. So part of it is making sure your child has the proper protection. But I wonder if, one of the reasons I wanted you on this call, because I think some of our businesses are going to need to help their local schools, because schools can't afford all this stuff. So if a company can help buy masks for all the first graders or all the, the second graders or whatever, that could be a big, big help for these schools. They're going to need them.
That's true, Lyle. And the other thing that we've heard that companies have really stepped up in trying to provide better access to the internet, particularly in rural areas. So we've heard about hotspots that have been provided by the Kentucky Career and Technical College system, so that families can drive into driveways or parking lots and access the internet if they can't access it at home. This is a short-term solution. We need better solutions, but this fall we may still need some of these short-term solutions. And I've heard of companies like McDonald's and others actually widening their broadband access so families can use the internet in their parking lots as well. So I think thinking about some of those things are areas where our businesses across the state can provide real short-term kind of rapid response support.
Cool. Other questions, Allison?
Yeah, we did have one come in. Can you provide any insight into any kind of regulations that are just related to online learning? So are there standards like for a number of hours that a student has to be online in order to meet the requirements, or is there a level of requirement for ensuring the child has been or is being monitored while doing online schooling?
And Jim, you may have some great information here as well. This is all a moving target right now for the state. Non-traditional instruction was designed as an approach to support districts where the weather made it difficult to get children into school buildings for stretches of time. But you know, those stretches of time were never more than a week or a couple weeks with heavy snow and ice. And so I think all of this guidance is still in the works. Schools are really trying to make sure that they're connecting with all students. But there aren't those kinds of requirements right now. And to move forward with those types of requirements, means we need to make sure that families have appropriate internet access. And right now, that's a private responsibility. We also need to make sure that school children have the right devices. And when I mention internet, it's also the bandwidth in the house when you have multiple students, as well as parents who are working from home. Having the appropriate bandwidth of your internet is important too. So it's going to be really difficult to regulate some of these things because we're not in the school building. Jim, you may have, you know, thoughts there and hearing where the conversation's going from a regulatory standpoint and an attendance standpoint. We know there are some kids that, you know, checked out in the spring and districts didn't hear from. So how do we get those kids?
Right. I think you're going to see a lot of issues with children redistricting too to a different school because now that they're going to remote learn, they can try to get pigeonholed into a different school and then force their way in once it reopens. You're going to see a lot of changes. There's some big changes that are going to come as an outcropping of this that nobody's even thought about. Whoops, sorry. Didn't mean to move forward. So are we ready?
Anything else? Any other questions?
We got one last question that I feel like has been addressed a little bit, but how much work is being done in developing online curriculum in a way that teachers, schools, and systems don't have to start from scratch? I think where you were saying they've been developing stuff based on planning ahead a week or a couple weeks, but.
So I think so many of our teachers have been scrambling, working on this through the spring months and into the summer months. I think as we've had the conversation about whether or not kids are going to come back into the school building or remote learning, that uncertainty has probably led some to back off of that design, which should be a cautionary note for us. That if we need to be remote learning, we need to develop those standards now and the right supports for teachers to develop those standards. So it's a priority that I'm glad one of your watchers is noting, something that we really need to pay attention to.
Okay, big challenges ahead. Does that wrap it up, Allison? Brigitte, thank you so much for your input here. Please feel free to join us or whatever you need to do. I know you've got a big day ahead of you, so this is going to be important that we do this right. And I hope that folks on the call, if you have resources that can help your schools think through this process, it needs to be a partnership between those schools and all these employers so that we can make this thing work for everybody. It's a challenge. Thank you again for being here, Brigitte. Really appreciate it.
Lyle, thank you so much.
You bet. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
And Jim, back to school considerations for employers and legal updates. And I guess you took care of the judge and everything went okay.
I did. All right. So you can hear me? Everybody can hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Excellent. All right. So let's roll. We'll get through this and see what we can do. I apologize for being late, but it sounds like nobody missed me anyway. So a couple of things I want to give updates on before we get to the back to school because these are real life things that we talked about last week. Last week we addressed the confusion regarding the temporary orders, emergency orders that have been issued by the governor. On Friday afternoon, the Kentucky Supreme Court issued a very short 3-page interim order that says that the governor's orders will be in place until the matter can be addressed by the Supreme Court. I think the reason for that is you have 120 different circuit courts where a temporary restraining order could be entered. Boone County, Scott County both rejected the governor's orders under the statute. Other judges had rejected such challenges, and I think that the Supreme Court, rather than, I don't believe this is a political statement, I don't believe that this is a final ruling that these things were accurate, but instead of having turmoil because of I think he's entered like 50 orders, if a judge, which Boone County Friday night was going to issue a blanket temporary restraining order that said all of the orders were in fact null and void, and so the Supreme Court came out and said, stop. Everything is going to stay in effect while we hear this matter. Bring all of it to us from both courts, and then we will address it. Any future orders attempting to set aside the governor's mandates will have to be, can be entered by a circuit court, no effect, and transmitted immediately by emergency directive to the Supreme Court. They will then address whether or not that order will take place now or later. So I just wanted you all to know the status of that. So all of the actions of any lower court have been set aside temporarily until the Supreme Court can rule on the merits. This does not say that the governor's mandates are accurate or not. It says that they will maintain the status quo to protect the health, safety, and welfare and for continuity along the state during COVID-19. So I do have a little comment down here with the exception of unemployment. Even though that's the law, the Kentucky unemployment still is refusing to do anything with that. Unfortunately, you'll see this in just a second. The federal money's run out this Friday in Kentucky, so they have delayed it long enough that it probably will not be utilized, and I think they did that on purpose. I look to see it be adopted as soon as the federal money is out. That way they don't have as many people using the funds that were set aside by the federal government. So, again, bottom line, until further notice, all executive orders have full force of law in the Commonwealth pending a Supreme Court ruling. Unemployment update. This is where I wanted to address with you. The unemployment assistance from the federal government runs out on the 31st of July. Unfortunately, Kentucky took no action to address how they calculate. If they had done an executive order, speaking of executive orders, that ran a special calculation for this week, people would have gotten benefits next week. Because they didn't, and our benefits run out Saturday at midnight, you have no ability to collect monies for next week. Kentucky could have fixed that. Several other states did. Kentucky did not. So everyone, your work share, which never took effect, runs out this Friday or Saturday. Your layoffs, the money from the federal government runs out on Saturday. There is no money next week because of how we calculate our benefits. So
it's too late to change that now, right, Jim?
I don't think he could administratively get it done since it took, 2 months to actually implement the unemployment in the first place, and we still have some people from April 3rd that still have not gotten their payments. I seriously doubt he's going to do anything with it. And it would only benefit people who are laid off for next week. It does affect $600 per person times all of the people on layoffs. It's a lot of money, but I don't think that he's going to do anything before Saturday. It would have taken a simple calculation to extend this week to an 8-week or to modify it in some way so that Sunday, which begins next week, would be part of the calculation, but that's not how they did it.
So you're concerned because this could be a surprise to a lot of people. They think they're going to get it through the entire month, but they're not. That's
correct. That's why I put on here this last point. If you have people on furlough or layoff, you need to address this with your employees because this is going to be a surprise to a lot of people. I think we mentioned it like 3 or 4 weeks ago, but it was only in passing because I think it was the last meeting we had before we took a hiatus. I think I mentioned it during that week because we had been giving guidance to people that the problem is the 31st doesn't end on a Friday, a Saturday, or a Sunday. It's the middle of the week. So we were trying to get information from the state. They were pretty vague about it, but several other states came out, and finally Kentucky did as well. So you need to talk to your employees about anybody who's on a layoff or furlough. If they were on work share, they've not gotten that yet. I use the term yet because I think there's relief available, because I don't believe that the Kentucky Unemployment Insurance Commission had discretion not to introduce and enforce the work share. They think they do. The law says otherwise, so stay tuned on that. But you need to talk to your employees because if they were on furloughs, they're expecting they're going to get another payment next week because the 31st is end of next week. They will not get that. They will lose all of next week. So you either need to get them back to work or they need to be aware. They will still get their up to $552 from the state. They just will not receive the federal unemployment assistance, the $600 additional that was available. So that's your update on Kentucky. So, Kentucky back to school mandate. I don't know why I did it this way. I didn't mean to, so you get to go through the clicks with me. I apologize. I thought I removed all of those. On the 24th, there was a new Healthy at School initiative, which kind of piggybacked on the Healthy at Work initiative that had been issued back in April. 5 key areas that were kind of covered a little bit earlier, but they were already in the slide, sorry. Social distancing, masks, health screening, sanitation, and contact tracing. Those are mandatory for all schools. If you want to know where the school systems are, I'll pull this up on the screen. This is available from education.ky.gov. This is the Healthy at School initiative. It's 24 pages long with information about how they did it. With regard to the bus strategies, I want to walk through with you. By the social distancing is in effect. Anytime they have 6 feet apart that they can't, then they have to have their masks on, during the day. Buses, they must load from back to front, sit with your siblings, wear your mask, and don't sit behind the driver. There'll be smaller class sizes. Everyone faces the same direction. 6-foot spacing between desks, and everyone must wear their masks. So those are the general guidelines. You can look through the rest of this with regard to what they've done. Again, it's on this website right there. And I'm going to go ahead and copy it and dump it into the chat. So if you want to pull it up later to talk to your employees about it, you'll have it. So those are the 5 key areas. In response to that, all 650,000 public school students will be required to wear a mask. This does not impact your private schools. They are entitled to make their own rules, but all public schools will be required. One caveat to this is no student can be punished for not wearing a mask. The teachers are to lead by example is what it says, and students are to be given a mask, but they cannot be punished if they don't have one when they show up. They cannot be turned away, and you're probably going to get into some issues about what if they take theirs off, what type of action, if any, can be taken. That's not yet been decided. I think it's going to be a district-by-district mandate. All students have to have their temperatures checked each day. Now, anyone that has been around an elementary school at drop-off will realize this is going to be an absolute debacle. I think it's one of the reasons why our schools are delaying the decision. You'll see here in a minute, Jefferson announced it was going to have its decision finalized by the 15th. Fayette did as well, of July. Both of them have delayed. Part of the reason is I don't know that they have the logistics established to take temperatures of thousands of kids. What do you do if it's pouring rain? What do you do if somebody doesn't pass the temperature check? You are hurting cats already trying to get them into the building, and this is going to be a nightmare for them to handle. That's part of the reason for the delay. All students are required to keep their distance from their peers. This accepts out, the masks. There are no masks for children who are in kindergarten or any of the early start preschool programs. Those do not apply. As of this morning, Jefferson, Fayette, several other public and private are still evaluating, so we don't have any guidance. The crazy thing is, I told Lyle absolutely by July 20th we can have this back to school mandate thing, because all of the schools, they would have to have it, because this is 1 month out, and you have to have decision making more than a month out because it takes time to implement. People have to comply, work schedules have to be changed. There's no way that we'll get beyond the 20th. And Chase, I'll give you some credit, because Chase said, I think we ought to wait a couple of weeks. And I said, if you wait a couple of weeks, it's going to be way too late. Well, Chase, you were right, because nobody has any decisions made and we're still in the dark. But I still have a lot of guidelines for you. And I kind of did it as a what if and then what you do. So Jefferson, as I said, anticipated an announcement by the, quote, middle of July. Fayette announced an intention to identify its steps, but it has not identified a deadline for any announcement. The superintendent came out on Friday and said, yeah, we're still evaluating. Things change every day, every minute, and we don't know what we're going to do. Stay tuned. We've received some direction from them. We did receive as well, there was a survey sent out asking what methods parents of students would be comfortable with, but we've not seen the results of those be released yet, so I don't know whether we have that or not. All right, so the reason for the back to school concerns really goes back to this FFCRA. So I want to walk through it again, and I had one of the best questions I've had, so I want to give credit. I won't throw your name out because I didn't ask, but it's at the bottom of the screen here, because we did cover this a long time ago, but then because this is coming back up 5 months later, a question comes up about what do you do if you've laid people off? They don't meet the 30-day, so you don't have to give them the 10 weeks of pay. So let me walk through this in order, and we'll get to the bottom of the screen. Don't look down there yet. Don't go down there. We're up here. Don't look. We're up here. All right. So 2 weeks of paid sick leave you're entitled to at the employee's regular rate of pay, where the employee is unable to work because they're quarantined or experiencing COVID-19, or 2 weeks of paid sick leave at 2/3 if the person is caring for a child who is not able to go to school. You'll see here these are the paid sick leave bolded and COVID-19 closure. We're going to get into depth in that in a second, but those are the two parts that are key here. This is 2 weeks paid sick, 2 weeks paid sick at 2/3 if the school is closed due to COVID-19. That's the paid sick leave. We ignored that somewhat earlier in the year because I didn't ignore it. We talked about it and then we just moved aside because almost everyone was subject to this number one, which is why I left it in here. Everyone was subject to a quarantine until you could work from home or figure anything out. So most of you in the regular working community, customer-facing business, you've already used your 2 weeks. So, or your employees have already used their 2 weeks, but I put it back in here so you could keep track of that. Then the third one down here is the sticky one. For anyone employed more than 30 days, up to an additional 10 weeks of paid expanded family and medical leave at 2/3 of the regular rate for anyone who is unable to work because a school is closed or unavailable due to COVID. I'm emphasizing those for a reason, and you'll see it here in a little bit. The last one is this, and this was a frequently asked question that we covered on April the 8th, I believe. I think it was week 4 or week 3. But we covered this in detail because the Department of Labor came out with a whole frequently asked question. And one of the questions was, well, what if we lay everybody off before April 1st? I'm just trying to trigger to you that was a huge discussion point we had. We talked about it for almost 2 hours about all these frequently asked questions. Well, one of the other ones that really didn't apply then because most everybody had their employees or very few of you had employees that were on a pregnancy FMLA leave, so they'd already used some of theirs, and so I didn't emphasize this last point, but now this last point is almost the key point, which is if you laid people off over this last couple of months, then they may not qualify for the FFCRA when you go back to work because, and this is how it defines it, they must be employed for at least 30 calendar days. If an employee is laid off and subsequently rehired by the same employer, i.e. furlough, layoff, termination to rehire, whatever, the employee may be immediately eligible for the EFMLEA leave. That's this third category, the 10 weeks of 2/3 salary for taking care of your child, only if you're employed 30 or more of the 60 calendar days prior to the layoff. So the problem is if you are still operating on a reduced or you are still in a situation, problem or benefit, is that you may have employees that may not qualify for the FFCRA if they have been laid off and they've not yet gone back to full work before the schools reopen in a month. So use this, HR people, to either benefit your employees or to cut ties with your employees. And I'm not suggesting one or the other, but if people don't meet the 60 calendar day test half the time, basically, then they may not qualify under the FFCRA. So I also wanted to cover this. How do you calculate benefits for employees needing to care for? I don't know why these are in this order, so I'm going to put them all up here. So how do you calculate benefits for employees needing to care for their own child or for their child during a forced school shutdown? Again, we have not gotten to the option question that Mary asked earlier. These are only if there's a forced school shutdown. We walked through this before, but I wanted it in here. You are entitled to sick leave if, whoops, my mouse is not working. There we go. Quarantine. Advised to self-quarantine. Well, everybody in the entire country was almost, except Idaho and North Dakota, I believe, were subject to mandatory quarantine and self-quarantine. Experiencing symptoms. We're skipping most of these, okay? And then caring for someone subject to a quarantine or an isolation order. Those still apply, but I'm skipping those because we're focused on number 5 here. You're caring for a child whose school or place of business is closed, and an employee qualifies for EFMLA-EA if they are caring for a child whose school or place of business is closed. So those are all the types of ways that you can calculate benefits. This is, again, the full calculation. It's 2/3 of your regular rate or 2/3 of the applicable minimum wage up to $200 a day and $12,000 in the aggregate over a 12-week period, two of which would be the sick leave, followed by 10 weeks of paid expanded FMLEA leave. So those are the calculations. All right, now this is something I wanted to bring back. We talked about it in week 3 and week 4, but this is critical now because you all are going to be hit with massive layoffs for employees with children as school starts back up. So I want to put it back in here so you can look back through and talk to your accounting tax people, your payroll people, everyone you need to. You get a dollar, what they called a dollar-for-dollar reimbursement of all monies paid to employees under the FFCRA. That's from the Department of Labor and the IRS. So businesses are able to do that through 2 different ways. One, any of the payroll taxes that normally go to the IRS are able to be withheld based upon sick or EFMLEA leave that has been paid. If the payroll taxes that you're paying are not sufficient to cover, you can seek an expedited advance from the IRS, and the forms are on there on the irs.gov website. To the extent that you are paying sick leave or expanded FMLEA, you need to make sure that you document and that you submit for reimbursement, because this was not supposed to be an out-of-pocket for the employer. The biggest issue for all of my employers that I represent, and all of you on this, is the lost work. You're going to lose employees, and you've got to figure out ways to work with them, especially with young children. So I'm going to give you advice on what I've done, and then you all can do what you need to do, and then figure out from there. But you, here in about 10 weeks into the school year, so around October, you're going to have a huge spike in unemployment. You're going to have a huge spike in people that have been laid off. So if you're looking for a dark cloud in the stock market without anything else from COVID, what you're going to look at is, as people are being required to deal with school issues, and the schools are not going to trigger as quickly as other things to reopen, when people run out of their FFCRA expanded FMLEA leave, they'll be left without any employment. So if you run the calculation in the big city centers from the first day of school and add up 10 weeks, that's where you're going to see the problem. Maybe 12 weeks, but most of those people have already used 2 weeks at the beginning of this. So I anticipate 2.5 months in, you're going to have some real difficulty across the country. So, sorry for the doom and gloom, but that's the update on that. So the governor's office came out on this back to school that we've talked about this morning with flexibility. He did the hashtag healthy at school. But then the office came out and said, well, we didn't do a whole lot of mandates. We did a whole lot of suggestions, and that's because we wanted the schools to have flexibility. Kind of like with the Healthy at Work officer that they declared, when a governor or an executive comes out with a mandate that then has flexibility in the mandate, all it does is create litigation, questions, disputes, and a whole lot of confusion for these schools. Schools are not set up to make the final decision. They're set up to comply with whatever laws and rules, regulations, and statutes exist. So when he did that, it's actually creating some confusion. They're left with several additional unanswered questions, and this also bleeds over then to employers. So if you're a school, you've got to deal with all of your teachers, them not wanting to come in, them trying to stay healthy at home. And here's the other crazy thing is you now have two competing healthy at initiatives that are contradictory of one another if you're trying to get children back to an in-school learning environment, because the governor has not lifted the, if at all possible, have people work from home mandate. He still has, as part of his Healthy at Work initiative, that if there's any possibility, you must allow your employees to work from home. Well, that would include teachers. And so that's part of the problem is I think you're now seeing, and I don't know that the office is thinking, the governor's office is thinking through all of the ramifications of old, outdated executive orders. But if you have an order that says every business must allow people to work from home unless it's not possible, well, how do you then enforce a school going back to school if you could do teleschool? So something has to change on the mandates, and the mandates haven't been updated frequently enough. The phases are not being cleaned up. So that's creating some issues. That's why you're not getting decisions made by the school systems. They don't have enough direction given to them as to what is and is not mandatory. Some of the earlier mandatory, i.e. home working from home, are creating an impossibility for getting people back to working at school. That's got to be cleaned up. So, under the FFCRA, employees are entitled, we just talked about it, but I want to make sure you understand, they're entitled to sick and FMLA leave only if the school is closed or unavailable due to COVID-19. So schools are reviewing different scenarios for reopening. We've had in Fayette County, for example, they've talked about half days, part-time, and remote. The most logical one that they've talked about, not logical, I'm sorry, most prevalent suggested was each child goes to school 2 days a week. They alternate which days so that the school is half full, Monday and Wednesday, or Tuesday and Thursday, and Friday is an at-home telework or teleschool for anybody who needs additional, but homework day for everyone getting schoolwork done. So you've got some children being required to go on Monday and Wednesday, some children on Tuesday and Thursday, and everyone's off on Friday. So the other one is half days. The problem with a half day is you've got a janitorial staff that's going to have to completely clean, wipe down, sanitize the entire school. They estimate that that will take hours, and the impossibility of getting that done in the hour to 2 hours before the next child comes in, I don't believe that that's a workable solution. The other problem with that is that in some of the schools they have, I know that they talked about buses, but some of the bigger jurisdictions are suggesting 0 buses. One of them, I'm dealing with an employee right now in Maryland, and their school has said they will not run buses. So parents are mandated to get their child to school, and some of the schools don't start until 8:45, and some of the people live 2 hours away from work because they work in Washington, D.C. So their ability to get back and forth to school, back and forth to work, and picking them up in the middle of the day to pick up at school will create unemployment for a lot of people. So Here's the concern. If the school allows the parent to choose which option they want, and they're going to do some of it remote learning, some of them will be in school, you get to pick and choose, well then go back up to the first bullet. You are not forced to work from home or not forced to have your child at home school. You are electing that. The law does not allow for parents to receive FFCRA if they choose to allow their child to stay at home, only if the school is closed as a result of COVID-19. So this is creating a nightmare where they're saying, would you like an option? And parents probably are going, yeah, you know, I'd like an option. I'd like to go every other day and homeschool so I can get some work done. Well, the problem is, if you select that option, your employer may not provide it. And then the other issue is this. I'm going back a screen. Question then becomes on the employer. Let's say you're a great, wonderful, loving employer. You see that you want to keep these people comfortable. You want them to be able to get their FFCRA at 2/3. So you're going to be the good employer. You're going to pay them. The question becomes, on the tax perspective, the IRS, I don't know whether people realize or not, they're not normally a warm and fuzzy organization. If you pay your employees and they don't qualify because they don't technically fall under the FFCRA because the school was not closed, it was an option, you may be on the hook. You may not be able to use your payroll taxes to get the money back from the federal government because they are only allowing, back again, only if you're caring for a child whose school or place of care is closed, not one where you've made the option to homeschool because the school has given you options. That doesn't qualify. So I have serious concerns as the law is currently written. I do believe you're going to see a change to this before school starts from the Congress, but right now, as it's written, the problem is you can't qualify for FFCRA if you are making the option. So we're back to the slide I was on. I just want to back up so you see the progression of what we're dealing with and some of the unanswered questions for employers. This is the bullet that I put on here, Chase. This is for you. We were expecting and anticipating additional guidance and instruction from both our governor, our Congress, and our local school systems. School systems are log jammed because the governor's mandates don't have what's required and what's not. The governor's, I guess, log jammed because he's got so many things going on with whether the executive orders will be allowed or not, and whether or not he wants to do anything else with the Healthy at Work while this thing is still trying to either spike or not spike. But the problem is you've got two competing issues that are going on. So absent the instructions, employers need to have a well-defined policy defining how employees can obtain leave, when they can do it, and how you're going to handle it. Until the FFCRA is addressed, you've got some issues that I'm not positive how we're going to handle those. I was hoping, again, we would have some kind of ticker toward the end of July. I haven't even heard rumor of Congress addressing this yet. Quite frankly, outside of me doing the research on this, I'm going to say a little bit, I've not seen a single law firm, accounting firm, audit firm, or anyone else across the country that has addressed the issues that are getting ready to hit. So I've been trying to do these all summer long for the companies I've been dealing with, but I'm not seeing anything out there. I don't see anybody just going, gee, this is a problem and the sky is falling. I'm not trying to be the Chicken Little, but I am looking at this realizing there's a lot of problems that are not being addressed, and it's not just our state, it's across the country. Busing, school, safe distance, schools were already overcrowded, so how do you handle that? And then if you're trying to do this option, you could unintentionally destroy a person's livelihood because they may not be able to qualify for the FFCRA. And that's very important for all of the HR people on here to realize is right now with the current law, if your employees are selecting an option, you need to talk to those employees because they need to push their schools to make it a mandate, not an option. Options are a problem because that means it's not closed. You made the decision, okay? So here's the breakdown of how this all works. Mary, this one's for you on your question. Under the option theory, we believe, and I believe because there's no guidance out there beyond the early on recommendations back at the beginning of April, DOL has not updated, IRS has not updated, no one didn't update. There was a complete lack of anything going on. I guess everybody's on 4th of July holiday with the federal government. But if there's a voluntary election by the employee to use remote learning, I believe that right now precludes the FFCRA sick leave and EFMLEA leave. If there's a mandatory remote learning component, part-time or half-day, that implements intermittent leave or full leave. So let me give you the scenarios there. I didn't have enough space on the slide, and I don't think it's on the next one. Yeah, that's just telling you what you need to do. So let me walk through these. So we talked quite a bit, early stages of FFCRA, about the frequently asked questions and what did or did not constitute leave. And we talked about the difference between sick leave and the difference between intermittent leave available under the EFMLEA. You can't be sick and say, I'm going to be sick on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but I'll be here on Tuesday and Thursday. So that's where you can't use intermittent leave. So sick leave typically is you're under a quarantine, you're under an executive order, or you're caring for someone that's under an order. Now, I could now see the way that this is working out with schools. If they open on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Tuesday, Thursday are clean days, or however they're going to do this, I could see the ability to claim sick leave under that scenario. It's going to be a decision that HR is going to have to get with its specialist, legal counsel, accounting, tax, whoever it is that you want to rely on. It's going to be a dicey scenario on sick leave because sick was intended to be being sick, and that's not something that's intermittent. Now, you could use, let's say, 4 days straight, and then you're back at work, and then you get sick again. Obviously, that applies. But the every other day was not intended as part of the sick leave, and they've not really supplemented with the appropriate information to apply that to the school situation. So, under the EFMLEA, here's how I see it working. Intermittent leave would be available if the student, let's go back to the hypothetical of Tuesday, Thursday, Monday, Wednesday, and nobody goes in on Friday. So if a student is required to go to school physically on Monday and Wednesday, but they're required to homeschool on Tuesday and Thursday and Friday, you would give them intermittent leave on Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday because that is a school directive that the school be closed for 2 days out of the week or 3 days out of the week, and they would be in school learning for the other 2 days a week. In that scenario, the person would get 3 days a week leave at 2/3. The other 2 days they would be expected to be at work. That's one scenario. And all of this, by the way, assumes that this is the primary person taking care of the child. Obviously, every person in the household can't claim 3 days off of work and use the 2-day, 3-day, and so on. One person. So if you have two people working out of the same household for the same employer, they don't both get to stay at home with the child. One gets to stay at home because they're caring for the child. They can decide which one you cannot. Again, that gets back to one of the frequently asked questions about the male and whether or not the husband could be the one staying at home or whether you could encourage the wife. You can't get involved in whether it's a man or a woman, who the child care provider is, and so on. All you can do is give the leave intermittently as required. The other one's a half day. It works the same exact way. So if an employee is required to pick their child up at noon and drop their child off at 8, you would want to give them that opportunity. Well, you're going to have to give them that opportunity under the FMLA, because all this does is expand the FMLA leave to include school situations. So those are the time periods. If it is mandatory, you can get leave. If it is voluntary, right now, you cannot. So don't have your employees doing a voluntary decision of, well, I think we'll homeschool. That's on them. You don't have to pay them, and the IRS may not allow you a dollar-for-dollar redemption on that. So that's the issue. All right, almost done here. Then we'll get to some questions. As you move forward during the back to school, it's critical to clearly and carefully define expectations, because you don't want to have future litigation pitfalls. One of those will be whether or not you properly calculated the 12 weeks, whether you properly gave sick leave / EFMLEA leave / did the person, or the next question, did the person voluntarily do this, or did the school mandate it? Are you allowing it, or is it required under FMLA? I see a big issue at the end. Expiration of FFCRA sick and FMLA leave must be handled strictly in accordance with the FFCRA. Why? Because you can't get reimbursement from the federal government if it doesn't, because they only allow the tax write-off if it is a proper leave under the FFCRA. The other why, if you do it wrong, guaranteed one of your employees is going to sue you. So you need to verify that you're doing it in accordance with the FFCRA. You need to verify that you're walking through, and you need to run your calculations for this back to work, the 30-day, in a 60-day time period. The one question that is not answered on there is, so what if the person was work sharing only 50% of the time, and they only did it for 30 out of the last 60 days? I don't know the answer to that because they didn't get into the weeds that far. My argument for the employer, if I were the attorney, would be it would not qualify, because the frequently asked question was designed to be an 8-hour full-time employee half of the time working. So if they were only working half of the time, they're not really working for those 30 days out of 60. They're working for 15 equivalent days out of 60. So that's how I would look at that, but I don't know that it's well defined yet. Well, I know it's not well defined yet. All right, so in essence, the expiration of the leave must be conducted, and this is important because everybody's been looking at FFCRA, but honestly, FFCRA, all it did was redefine FMLA. So you must comply with FMLA leave. So go back, open your books, dust them off. You have to comply with that. You have to give appropriate notification. You have to adhere to the proper calculations. You have to do everything the way the FMLA allows. The only difference is 2/3 for caring for a child, and this expands leave to allow for these types of situations that are unique to COVID-19. So this is the part I talked about earlier. You've got to be ready for a mass simultaneous expiration of leave among your employees with school-aged children. I would suggest you try to stagger now, working out some kind of an arrangement with your employees. You may want to start thinking outside of the box. Could you hire some kind of service to pick up people's children from school, bring them to the office, having some kind of care at the office? Am I saying that's a good idea? No, not until you have a well-defined policy, because now you've got somebody driving children, you've got exposure to liability, but you're going to have to be creative, because this is going to be a trigger down the road at 10 to 12 weeks into the school year that I don't believe anybody's ready for. So I would highly recommend implementation or modification of your well-defined policies to allow for flex time, work from home, and other measures designed to avoid the absence of employees caused by the FFCRA sick and leave policy triggering 10 to 12 weeks in. One of the things as HR people you probably need to start considering is sitting down and finding out from your employees, and you have to be careful with how you do this. because obviously you can't ask certain questions, and we all know that, and I'm not suggesting that you go across that line. However, do you have children? Do you have concerns about, maybe this is the right way to ask it, do you have concerns about the upcoming child care time period? Is there something we can do? Does your spouse have a different work schedule? Could we put you on second shift temporarily to assist so that you always have someone to care for your child? Is there a way for us to put you on flex schedule during school? Do you want to work Saturdays and Sundays instead of during the week? You all have got to get creative, or else at the end of this 12-week period, you're going to have a bomb that nobody's thinking about. And how do you fix something where half of your population, 2/3 of your population, drops out of the workforce because they've run out of leave? So that's a real serious concern and question you need to be building on now. And Chase, the one thing I'll say is that's why I wanted to do this now, is even if the state's not ready, even if the localities are not ready, as HR professionals, you all know that you require more than a few weeks of lead time to fix the policies. So we wanted to have this discussion earlier. We just hoped that they would have done things earlier so that we would be up to speed on it a little more than we are. So this is the last slide. I want to walk through it really, really quick. A few little primers. Maintain all of your proper calculation for FMLA, FMLEA, and sick leave under COVID. Remember, we talked about this before, FFCRA is not in addition to FMLA. So early on when we were talking, there were just a few of you that had people that were expiring on FMLA leave, and we talked about this in week 3 and week 4. It's back again because now we're several weeks down the road. You may have had people out for surgeries. You may have had people out already for school. You may have had any other reasons. So now you need to go back and verify that people have not exhausted their 12 weeks of leave in the requisite time period so that you know whether or not people are out of leave before you start giving it to them again. Why? Because what if you do for one person and you don't for the other, then you get sued for the one you didn't do it for. It's not just about being a good employer, it's about being fair across the board. If you do it for one, you have to do it for all, so you darn well better make sure you are either giving additional or you're properly calculating it. You need to develop or update all of your policies for the new normal, whether that means working from home, whether that means flex shift, whether that means building a second or third shift. And it doesn't matter whether you're in an office setting that, let's take a law firm. You may need to implement second and or third shift because it's that difficult to have a full staffed operation working with all of the requirements that are in for masks and for space considerations. And the other thing is, with the school situation, with people needing flex time, you may need to establish second and third shift. If you don't have a work from home strategy, you need to do it if at all possible. I know that some of you have factories and you can't do it there. Others, I think you can tuck this in and figure out ways to do it, even if it's a couple hours a day. One of the things I've suggested for people, because they can't get enough hours into the workday, and they had mechanics. These are airline mechanics, so we're talking big time, not car. They ran out of time of the day to have people there because of social distancing and so on. So one of the things I recommended was 2 hours a day, 3 hours a day, 4 hours, whatever you want. A work from home educational report. They go get their continuing education and they report to the employer. Be creative. Come up with ways to help your employees help themselves, and ultimately that helps you. So we have developed incredible outside-the-box type scenarios to try to help, because at the end of the day, that'll make your employees happy that you're trying. And if you can come up with these creative methods for, HRCI credits or SHRM credits, or think outside of HR, mechanic credits, other things that you're doing where they can get some time paid for doing something, it's better than losing your good employees. So little reminder, Computer network, HIPAA, PCI compliance and security. If people are working from home, don't allow them to use an unsecure website. Don't allow them to use Siri or Apple, any of the other things that are great to use, or Google, but aren't good if you're giving them confidential, trade secret, proprietary information. Remember your workers' compliance. Nail them down to one area of the house. Nail them down to a proper work area, and remember, you are required for coming up with reasonable accommodations even if they're working at home. Think about your flex schedule and arrangements. Remember to include work hours. I have had the nightmare situation where somebody said I was working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week because I was working at home. Don't allow them to answer emails outside of work. Don't allow them to have their computer outside of work, and don't allow them to have access granted to anyone else. And remember that you're ultimately required to have OSHA required safety considerations, whether they're at home or not. If you can't allow remote working, new policies, new work hours, and new normal is what you're going to want to consider. So that's basically where we are, Lyle. And I know there's a whole lot of questions. I saw them popping in, but because I joined late, I was really not able to put them up there.
Yes, so I have quite a few questions. Let's start with this one. On the sick leave, it states that if an employee gets overtime, then you have to calculate that into the sick leave wages. Is that also true for employees that receive tips?
Yeah, so tips and overtime are to be included. If you didn't have, I'm going to go to the overtime first because it was asked first. If you didn't have a sufficient time period for determining what amount of overtime was being used, there's a specific calculation in the frequently asked questions as to how you would do that. One of the things that I don't know is fully addressed, and I don't know how to tell you this without doing a lot of legal research on it, is the issue related to how do you determine overtime if the person really hasn't worked overtime in the last 60 days, but back in April we could have calculated overtime by looking at the first quarter and determining the amount of overtime over that time period. I think the time period has changed, and I think a lot of employers are going to be able to recalculate not based on overtime because they're not doing overtime right now. Now, I'm not telling you that that's what the law is because I have not pulled it to research all of the frequently asked questions across all of the federal regulatory agencies, but my inclination is that if the 30 days out of 60 is in there, then the overtime is also going to be part of this. People are not going to get paid based on overtime because over the last 60 days they weren't working overtime, and that's going to be your calculation time period. On the tips, the way the tips worked was you were supposed to base it on the reported tips unless it was clear that the tips weren't necessarily reported, and then you were supposed to do a, quote, good faith estimate based upon what you believe the tips would be. Again, with tips, I think we're going to have a huge problem because people over the last 60 days have a different calculation of their tips than they have when they were doing this before COVID started. When FFCRA was passed, one, it was never anticipated it would go into effect this long. Two, it was never anticipated that people would be laid off for such a long period of time that the calculations based upon their last quarter or their last time period would be this screwed up. So I do believe that we're probably going to have some modifications to that coming shortly from Congress, but we don't have them yet. So keep them rolling.
What options do we have for exempt employees who are working reduced hours due to childcare, such as 5 hours a day and no option for telework? Can I reduce pay and use EFMEA, or do I have to pay full salary because they're exempt?
So this is an exempt employee? Exempt employee creates problems because, as we remember from when we had the Kentucky Unemployment Insurance people on, exempt employees get paid whether they work or not. So you've got a little bit of a problem with the exempt employees taking 5 hours a day or 3 hours a day. you'd be better off if that employee was taking the full day off and running that day. But what you need to do as the employer is keep track of the number of hours, because that still goes to their FMLA total amount of leave that they're allowed. It's intermittent leave. You have to pay them full if they are exempt. If they're not exempt, then what you're going to do is pay them the 2/3. Now, let me hesitate on that, because I think that there may be something in the regs about a salaried employee getting 2/3 as well. So I may need to supplement afterwards on that, because that gets into the weeds a whole lot, and that may require a lot of research. But let me think about that a little bit, because I do know that salaried employees are entitled to 2/3 of their wages if they are on FMLA leave. Sick leave is a little different. I'd need to research that more, but I think the regulations actually covered salaried employees as well, differently than just, again, they didn't anticipate people being out of work for 3 hours a day every day because of childcare. But the law is the law, regardless of whether it was anticipated or not. So I think that we're probably going to have some changes to that. But right now, let me look into that a little bit on the salaried employees. So there was a question earlier about, I want to throw this one out. We haven't talked about the safety of the teachers and the school employees. As they get sick, we'll see a huge problem keeping either in school or remote learning functioning. I see this being a huge issue, but I'm going to say something else. I don't know that it's any different than the flu. I know that it may be more contagious, but we deal with this every year with the flu as well, where teachers get the flu or it starts going around the school. Then you're going to have the school individually shut down. I don't believe they're going to do a full county shutdown, but you're going to see school-to-school shutdown. You're also going to see a tremendous number of elderly teachers that are going to take advantage of the work from home and not come into school. So I see that being a next big step. So there's a question on here. Do you want me to do them, or you want to roll?
Either way.
I see one on here that says, what happens with the $600 for those who have open claims from March? Will they still be eligible to receive based upon benefit week, or will it not be available because the payment takes place after July 31st? Excellent question. It's one of the frustrations I've had with the Kentucky Unemployment Insurance Commission. We have people all the way back to beginning of March. They did not receive anything for the entirety of March or April until they received their first check. And their first check it was not backdated. It didn't pay them for the time period they were unemployed. It only paid them from the date of application forward. We don't have a clue what's going to happen with the $600. That also impacts everyone who utilized or attempted to utilize WorkShare, because my personal belief is, my professional legal personal belief is, all of those employees who were put on WorkShare are entitled to the $600 per week because they fully complied, their employer fully complied, they applied to the state, and the state didn't do something that is a mandatory directive by the governor under an executive order. I do believe that there's litigation coming on that. That's all I'll say, because it's a widespread issue. It affected about 15 of my employers, and I was spearheading the application process for multiple, and none of them got WorkShare, including one that was told how to do it and has the emails walking through how to do it from A to Z, and was promised it would be there. I believe this is impacting employers with over 3,000 down to people who have 2 or 1. The problem is that payments will dry up from the federal government, and I believe the federal government was clear to the states that they had to get these things fixed They would give the money. The state had to tell them to do it, but the money dries up on the 31st. So the money will then probably have to come from the state to make things right. They don't have the money to do it. Unfortunately, they were too incompetent to get it done when they should have. And that's all I can say. They've disappointed me on this throughout all of their steps. They haven't done what they should have done, and they've not protected the employees or the employers that relied on their workforce or work share strategy that they asked everybody to start using. They didn't then back it up. So that kind of falls in line with the question of will those people whose claims are in limbo still receive their full payment, including the federal? I sure hope so. That's why I've been fighting like crazy to get them to get their act together. It's why it frustrated us back in March when we had them on in week 2, and they were telling us there's absolutely nothing wrong with their website. Everything works perfectly, and I drug it down on the screen and said, well, I can't get in right now. That's part of the reason. And the one question from Angie, will the state benefit continue? Absolutely. For reduced hour, absolutely not. Sorry, I read the first part. Kentucky unemployment will still continue up to the maximum of $552 per week. Kentucky does not, according to the Unemployment Insurance Commission, recognized reduced hour employees, period. Even though there's an executive order, 787 KAR 1:350E, the governor signed into law the emergency executive order that has now been approved as well by the Supreme Court that said it is in fact the law and you are in fact entitled to work share, and there is in fact a need for it right now. Unfortunately, Kentucky still does not recognize work share. The commission does not. Question about art and music may be for our other guest if she's still on, because it asks, will they lose their classrooms due to the need for more space for music or art? I would include in that gym class. I think you're going to see a lot of outdoor classes when possible because of the same issues. I'm not sure. Anything else?
Yeah, so how would the law apply, or what are your thoughts on how it may be handled if school is open but aftercare isn't available?
So let me back up here. Going back to a slide, so give me just a second. I cut it out there. Let me go back. So number 5 here answers the question, and I just want to make sure I pointed it out to you. It is a child whose school or place of care is closed. So this applies whether it's a daycare all day or whether this is an after school care if that is unavailable. Employees need to document that their after school care is not available, whether it's the YMCA that exists, whether it's a school run, whether it's I can't remember some of the other ones that were there. There were several different ones that made after school available at elementary schools. If that's not available, you're going to have to accommodate your employees in some way, shape, or form. That's kind of what I was talking about with the start and end of school. I've been pushing for this. It's personal. I've been pushing for this for a long time. I think you're finally going to see something I've been asking for, which is I see no reason for high school kids to start at 7 o'clock in the morning. Elementary school kids to start at 7 o'clock in the morning and be off at 2:15 in the afternoon when their parents have to work all day. And high school kids don't get off until 4:30, but half of them can drive back and forth. And if they're latchkey kids, they can go home, unlock the door, and go in and be safe because they're 15 to 18 years old. You may well finally see, and if you don't like this, sorry, it's just mine. You may well finally see that elementary school will start later at a reasonable time and end closer to the end of a parent's school work day, so that you don't have to have a situation where kids are needing after school for 3 or 4 hours while the parent's trying to get done with work. So I'm hoping that will switch. That's one that makes common sense. Allow the older kids to be off earlier, allow the middle school to be off earlier because they are a little better at taking care of themselves, and have the little kids from 5 years old to 11 be able to be picked up by their parents once work is done a little bit later in the day. So look for that to possibly happen. So I think that was that question.
Jim, there's another question out there that's, I believe what they're asking is, let's say somebody works for Toyota and they're always in Scott County and they pay Scott County taxes, but now they actually live in Fayette County and now they're working from home. Should the company change their tax basis for local tax to Fayette County since that's where they're working?
So yeah, that's something I've actually had to deal with. I believe you have to change the tax if this is going to be a long term. If it's a part-time situation where they maintain an office in Scott County, but this is a temporary measure to work from home, then that's something where you're probably going to have to get some legal guidance and accounting more than legal tax guidance on which applies. I can tell you that if it is a permanent, then you need to change permanently to the location where the majority of the work is being conducted, which would be their home base. If it's temporary, that's where you're into that murky area. I thought you were going to ask another question, which is along the same lines, and then second, how to deal with the school situation. So hypothetically, taking your hypothetical one step further, do you pay Scott County taxes for school taxes, or do you pay Fayette County? I think that would go with where the person's home base is. That's number one. That's not where I thought you were going. Where I thought you were going was, so if an employee, hypothetically, works in Scott County, child went to school in Fayette County, but now everybody's homeschooling, and it would be easier because, well, take the reverse of that. They live in Fayette County, work in Scott. Child went to Scott County because it was easier with the parent. They got that to work out somehow. Can you force the parent to change schools for their child, public schools, based upon where they actually reside? Because Fayette County, hypothetically, is going back to school in person, and now that person can come back to work if they were in Fayette County versus Scott County. And that kind of gets to the question that I was asking earlier, the concern about people cherry picking what school they're going to have their kid go to in order to either stay home or to not stay home. I see a nightmare on the horizon about parents saying, well, I was going to send my child to Peter and Paul, and they don't allow anything but homeschool. Or, yes, I'm in the jurisdiction of Dixie Elementary, but I want to send my child to Glendover because Glendover has adopted the every other day versus the in-school. And I'm making up which school. I don't have any insight. I'm just making up different schools. But you're going to see some parents that I think are going to pick the schools. The answer is I don't think that the employer can enforce any kind of limitation on where the child goes to school because that's the parent's choice. However, you could get into challenges about people bringing their child across the county line. I know of many people who, I guess they claim homelessness, but they wanted their child to go to Fayette County, but they live in Bourbon County. So they drive down to Windy Corner Restaurant every morning, and the school bus has to pick them up because that's in Fayette County. And they just park there and wait for the bus, and then they drop their kid off and they go to Fayette County. So that's a little, you're going to see some of those gamesmanship things going on, and HR is going to have to be on top of that because that's going to create some real confusing things. And what can you and can you not enforce as the employer of record? I'm going to move this forward. Not that we won't answer any other questions, but I want to let everybody get the codes that we have.
Thank you.
So I'm going to put that on the screen while we answer any other questions. I know we're at the hour and a half, though.
Yeah, so here's one more. I have a few, but I'll just kind of hit the highlights. If two parents are in the home and work for different employers, can they both take off on the at-home days?
No. Parents cannot use this if there are other people available. Again, if you go back, well, I'm not going to move the slide back, but it says if no other child care is available. Well, if your spouse, your significant other is available, by definition, one of you is available, the other one then has to work. You can't both claim to be unable to get another child care alternative if both parents are at home. Someone is the alternative. Now, are you going to have employees abusing this? Yeah, absolutely. But if you catch them, you have for cause to fire people for violation of policies. That gets back to you need an extraordinarily well-defined policy that sets out, look, people, if you are at home and someone else can care for your child, you can't stay at home. You have to come into work, or you have to work from home, whatever the case may be. But you can't claim EFMLEA if there's an alternative, including your spouse, including your parent that lives with you, including other alternative arrangements that you have available. Employers have to be careful not to get caught in that, but employees can't abuse that.
Okay. Do you anticipate more protections coming for those who have used the 10 weeks but school is still out and they can't return?
I don't know that I anticipate the Congress moving quick enough to come up with that, but there is a phase 4 coming with more money, but this is going to be money trying to encourage people to get back to work, not to stay at home. I don't know whether phase 4 will cover extending the FMLEA for people with students or children in school. I don't know that that's part of it, but I have heard that by the end of July we may well have phase 4 that expands the monies that are available, but it's actually going to pay people to get back to work and not to be at home. Part of the reason for that not yet being adopted are all of the spikes in some of the bigger states, Texas, Florida, New York, New Jersey, California, Nevada, other states with big spikes. They don't necessarily want to pay people to go back to work and have the same disaster they had with the PPP all being paid in an 8-week period where people just dumped money out there and then nobody actually worked. So I think they're being a little bit more circumspect with trying to make sure to do this the right way. There was a question I want to throw out really quick. Doesn't matter whether it's individual care or any kind of after-school care or anything else. You can have an individual babysitter that says, I'm no longer available due to COVID-19. Technically speaking, under the guidelines, that's sufficient to warrant the ability to use FFCRA. I would question that if this is a brand new relationship, because you can't try to create an FFCRA, but if they had a pre-existing relationship with an individual or a small child care provider situation and that person is unable due to COVID-19, they would qualify. A lot of stuff on back to school this week. I didn't know that we would cover a whole hour, but we could have covered 2.
Well, thank you, Jim. Appreciate it. And Autumn, thanks for stepping in on the questions. Does that wrap it up pretty well?
Yeah, I think that's good.
We'll try to get this stuff summarized and out to everybody. We certainly appreciate everybody signing on for today's call. I hope you'll consider how you might be able to help your local schools and all the challenges they're facing. If you've got people that are talented in solving complex problems, maybe you could loan them to the school system for a bit. Any final words, Jim?
No, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody. Let us know if you have other things that you want to cover in the future, and it's always appreciated to be able to talk to the HR professionals in the state of Kentucky.
All right. Everybody have a great day, a good weekend coming up, and oh, wait a minute, good week coming up. I'm on vacation. I've lost track of time. And thank you all for all your efforts. Good work. Talk to you later.
Thank you, guys.
You bet. Bye-bye.